Just a quick little announcement before we get into today's video. I've started a Stickman Talks Substack and newsletter. The current working title of the newsletter is Stories I Want to Talk About But Can't, and as the title suggests, it'll contain breakdowns of stories I would love to cover on my YouTube channel but don't have time to. The first edition of this newsletter is currently live over on my Substack now, free for all to read. Payment is completely optional. My current hope is to do one of these weekly and break down like 5 or so news stories that I believe need more attention. So if that's of interest to you, feel free to check it out at the link down below in the description. I'll also likely have other written content coming on there from time to time, and maybe even a Patreon coming soon, though I'm still working out the details of all of that, so stay tuned. Anyways, with that small announcement out of the way, let's get into today's video. Let's talk about Callais versus Louisiana and its impact on the 2026 midterms. Wow, a double pop. I think that's history for this channel. I don't think I've ever used that sound effect twice in a video before. Welcome back to Stickman Talks, everyone. As of the time of me uploading this video, it's late October 2025, which means we are officially just over 1 year away from the 2026 US midterm elections. I'll be honest, this video was originally going to be a way too early preview of the 2026 midterms, but nothing is normal anymore and a lot has changed since I started planning it out. Instead, today, I'm going to be taking the time to discuss a current Supreme Court case by the name of Callais versus Louisiana and how it could change the 2026 midterms, as well as potentially change the way elections are held in this country for good. If you haven't been following the news recently, you may have missed a few headlines that the Supreme Court, or at least the conservative majority on it, appears sympathetic to further weakening the Voting Rights Act of 1965. More specifically, as Politico describes it, quote, several conservative justices signaled outright hostility toward the long-standing interpretation of Section 2 of the 1965 law, which broadly prohibits discrimination in voting practices on the basis of race or creed. Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch all suggested that race-conscious district lines might be unconstitutional. Now, this case hasn't been fully decided yet. The state of Louisiana has asked the Supreme Court for its ruling by early 2026. We usually see their rulings on big cases closer to the end of their terms in May or June of each year. Regardless of when we see it though, the impact of this ruling could change this country forever. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how a post-Section 2 world might reshape midterms, who's in danger, and where I think control of Congress could tilt. But before we get into all of that, we first need to understand a bit more about this specific Supreme Court case, as well as the history of the Voting Rights Act. Let's get into it. Detailing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Alright, before we get into how this could change the 2026 midterms, we need to talk about what's actually on the chopping block here, because Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act sounds technical and boring, but it's one of the few remaining laws that actually forces states to treat voters equally when drawing maps. Section 2 was passed in 1965 alongside the rest of the Voting Rights Act, and it basically says you can't have voting laws or district maps that discriminate based on race. Even if the lawmakers behind it didn't intend to discriminate, the law still applies if the effect of what they did ends up diluting the power of minority voters. In other words, if you redraw a map that takes a city with a large Black or Latino population and slices it into 5 separate pieces so those voters can't meaningfully elect a candidate, that's a Section 2 violation. It's a simple idea. Your vote should count the same no matter where you live or what race you are. Now, this part of the law has been used for decades to challenge unfair maps, and it's one of the few tools left after the Supreme Court already gutted other pieces of the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder struck down the part that required states with histories of racial discrimination to get federal approval before changing voting laws. That was Section 5. Once that fell, Section 2 became the main weapon civil rights groups had left. It's how cases like Allen versus Milligan in 2023 happened, the one where the court ruled Alabama had violated the act by drawing maps that weakened Black voting power. That case surprised a lot of people because the conservative majority on the court actually upheld Section 2 protections. But now, just 2 years later, the court looks ready to go in the opposite direction. The case currently in front of them, Callais versus Louisiana, could decide whether Section 2 even applies to redistricting anymore. Louisiana's argument is that the law shouldn't be used to require quote-unquote racial proportionality in maps, and that plaintiffs should have to prove intentional discrimination, not just discriminatory results. If that argument wins, and based on the justices' questioning it very well could, Section 2 would be stripped of its teeth. States could redraw maps however they want, and unless someone admits on tape that they did it to target a racial group, there'd be no way to challenge it. That's the immediate legal story here, but the political stakes are enormous. If Section 2 is gutted, state legislatures will have free reign to redraw districts without fear of being sued for racial gerrymandering. In states like Texas, where Republicans are already redrawing their congressional map to lock in new GOP-leaning districts, that would mean they could push those boundaries even further. And in states like California, which has Proposition 50 on the ballot this year to temporarily suspend its independent redistricting commission and let the legislature draw new maps, it could mean Democrats doing pretty much the exact same thing. We'd be entering an all-out map war, not just between red and blue states, but between those that even pretend to care about fair representation and those that that don't. This is why people are calling it one of the most consequential cases for American democracy in decades. If the court decides that Section 2 doesn't apply to redistricting, the 2026 midterms will be the first national election in more than half a century where states can draw maps without meaningful federal oversight. And that means for millions of voters, the shape of their district could matter more than the candidate they choose. How overturning Section 2 changes map power. So let's imagine that next year the Supreme Court actually does it. They weaken or overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. What happens next? Well, the short version is that the balance of power between state legislatures and the courts shifts overnight. Right now, Section 2 acts like a speed bump for lawmakers who push too far when drawing maps. It doesn't block gerrymandering entirely, but it slows it down, especially when race is clearly being used as a factor. Civil rights groups can sue, show that a map cracks or packs minority communities, and sometimes win in court. Without Section 2, though, that mechanism disappears. The only protection left would be the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, which requires proof of intentional discrimination, and that's almost impossible to prove. All a state would have to say is, we drew this map for political reasons, and that would be enough to end the case, unless there was evidence to the contrary. That kind of ruling would turn redistricting into a straight power contest. Whoever controls the legislature controls the map. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, Republicans currently have full control in 23 states, compared to 15 for Democrats. That imbalance matters because most congressional districts are drawn at the state level. Take Texas, for example. As I've already kind of mentioned, lawmakers there passed a mid-decade redistricting plan that added several new GOP-leaning seats. Civil rights groups, including the NAACP, sued under Section 2, arguing that the new map weakens Latino voting power. But if Section 2 disappears, those lawsuits end. The new lines would stand, even if they carve up cities like San Antonio and the Rio Grande Valley in ways that minimize Latino representation and secure more Republican seats. Over in California, meanwhile, Democrats are moving in the opposite direction politically, but using the same tools. Early voting is already underway for Proposition 50, which I just mentioned, and based on the results we've seen, it seems likely that it will pass. The goal, according to Democrats, is to regain some national balance after what we've seen Republicans do in states like Texas and North Carolina. If Prop 50 passes and Section 2 no longer applies, California's legislature would have room to draw several new Democratic-leaning seats with little risk of a successful legal challenge. That's the reality both sides would face: the end of meaningful federal oversight on maps. States with one-party control could redraw lines to cement their advantage for more than a decade. In the South, that would mean fewer majority-minority districts and fewer opportunities for Black and Latino voters to elect candidates of their choice. Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, and Alabama would all see major changes, because those are the states where Section 2 has been used most often to defend minority representation. Blue states would react too. Obviously, we've already talked about California, but Illinois might tweak its districts again as well, and New York could revive its 2022 maps that were struck down for being too aggressive. Every legislature with power to act would test how far it can go, and there wouldn't be much standing in their way. So with all of that in mind, it's time to ask the main question of today's video. How does this potentially impact the 2026 midterm elections? The 2026 midterms under new maps. Okay, let's get into what happens if these new maps actually take effect. If Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is weakened, it changes the 2026 midterms entirely before the first campaigns even hit the ground running, even though some already have, but you get the idea. We'll start again with Texas, because I'd argue that's the most aggressive example right now. As I mentioned previously, lawmakers there approved a mid-decade map change this past summer that reshaped several competitive districts. According to the New York Times, the plan turns at least 3 seats that Biden carried in 2020 into safe Republican districts by cutting up urban areas and stitching them together with conservative suburbs and rural counties. Long story short, there would be fewer competitive districts and more GOP safe ones. And as I've said, civil rights groups immediately sued, but if the Supreme Court gets rid of Section 2, that lawsuit doesn't matter. Those newly engineered seats would likely stick through 2030, barring some major political earthquake. Democrats could lose up to 5 seats in Texas alone before even factoring in voter sentiment or campaign performance. Now let's look again at California, where Democrats are trying to counter that move in Texas with one of their own. If Prop 50 passes, Democrats could redraw several competitive seats in Orange County, the Central Valley, and even parts of San Diego to favor their incumbents. Early analysis from the New York Times shows the proposal could shift 4 to 6 seats leftward, largely by consolidating Democratic voters who are currently split between multiple districts. If Section 2 no longer applies, there would be almost no federal oversight on how that's done. This creates kind of a mirror effect in red and blue states. In a Section 2 world, states could only go so far before courts would step in. In a post-Section 2 world, the only limit is how shameless you're willing to be. I even saw someone float a hypothetical map on X that would allow California to redraw 52 blue seats and basically hand all of their representatives to Democrats. That's probably not going to happen, but it could be technically possible. And Texas and California aren't the only ones. Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana would almost certainly redraw again if given the chance. In Louisiana's case, the state has already hinted that if it wins, it'll revert to its old single-majority black map. That's another potential Democratic loss right there. North Carolina is another one to watch. The Republican legislature there has already passed maps that could give the GOP an advantage in 10 of the state's 14 congressional districts. Democrats are suing under Section 2, and state-level constitutional claims. If Section 2 falls, those challenges become a lot weaker. All told, we'd be looking at a House map where 8 to 10 seats that might otherwise lean Democratic instead become safely Republican. And it wouldn't be because of campaigns or messaging or turnout, but because the lines where voters live changed. And when you consider that Republicans currently hold a razor-thin majority, that's enough to secure control of the House through at least 2030. But the effects wouldn't all cut one way either. As I've said, states like Illinois and New York would also likely redraw maps of their own if Section 2 and related precedents fall away. Illinois could shore up some of its Chicago area districts to make them nearly impossible for Republicans to win. And some New York Democrats have already floated the idea of reviving the gerrymander that was struck down in 2022. Without Section 2 in place, they'd have a much easier time defending it in court. So we'd have two simultaneous trends: red states expanding their control in the South and Sunbelt, and blue states locking in their dominance along the coasts. The problem is that these moves don't cancel out each other neatly because the population growth that's driving new seats is mostly happening in red states. This means the GOP's map advantage scales faster than the Democrats' ability to offset it elsewhere. For voters, the difference would be immediate. The number of competitive House districts, which already dropped from about 90 in 2012 to fewer than 40 in 2024, according to Cook Political Report, could fall into the 20s. Fewer swing seats means fewer races where voters can actually change outcomes. Most Americans would live in districts where the winner of the race is decided months before Election Day. And for minority voters, the change would be even sharper. Majority-minority districts could be split apart, either by cracking communities across multiple white majority seats or by packing them so tightly together that their influence outside those boundaries disappears. And that's not a hypothetical either. That's exactly how states like Texas and Georgia drew maps before the Voting Rights Act was ever put in place. So when we talk about the 2026 midterms, arguably the biggest story here isn't about which party has the momentum or how people feel about the economy, but what the maps will even look like. If Section 2 falls, we'll be entering the first national election in nearly 60 years where states can draw districts without any real federal constraint. Considering that, I'm now going to try to make some sort of prediction as to how this midterm season may go. Let's get into it. Trying to predict the 2026 midterms. I'll be honest, I know I just said I'm going to try to make some prediction, but I can't give you a specific prediction right now. There's just too much going on and it's way too early to say how things may go. I lied to you, my dear viewer. I'm very sorry. But anyways, if the Supreme Court weakens Section 2, we'll enter an election cycle where the guardrails around fair representation are loose enough that most states could get away with almost anything. The lawsuits will keep coming, but the precedent will already be gone. And the practical reality is that the maps we have now may not be the ones we're going to vote on next year. That kind of change doesn't cause a single headline-grabbing shift, but it will cause a slow structural tilt, the kind that shows up in the numbers months later when people realize how few seats were ever competitive to begin with. At the same time, Donald Trump has been pulling more of the federal government under his control. The Department of Justice has gone quiet on many cases that might make the White House look bad. Where are the Epstein files? And has also begun prosecuting some of Trump's former political opponents. Immigration enforcement has become one of the administration's favorite tools for projecting authority. The nationwide ICE raids that started in late summer haven't slowed down, and they've sparked protests that are now being met with a noticeably heavier hand. There's also been talk from within Trump's orbit about invoking the Insurrection Act if the protests keep coming, something that hasn't been used in this country since the early 1990s and never on this kind of scale. Trump even said in a recent interview with Fox News when asked about sending federal troops to San Francisco, quote, "Don't forget, I can use the Insurrection Act. 50% of the presidents almost have used that, and that's unquestioned power. I choose not to, I'd rather do this, but I'm met constantly by fake politicians who think it's not like part of the radical left movement to have safety. These cities have to be safe." All of this means the 2026 midterms won't play out in a normal environment. They'll happen under a government that is actively consolidating power, while the legal frameworks that usually keep elections fair are being stripped down. It's the kind of moment where process matters as much as policy, because the people who control the process are starting to shape it to fit their needs. Republicans could gain anywhere from 5 to 10 seats in the House without running better campaigns or winning new voters. Those aren't projections based on polling, they're baked into geography and math. That's why I think the 2026 midterms will look less like a national referendum and more like a controlled test of how much influence one party can lock in before the next redistricting cycle. The maps, the courts, and the machinery of the federal government are all moving in the same direction. It's slow, procedural, and hard to dramatize, but it's how real power consolidates, and it is seriously concerning. Like the downfall of what this country was founded on concerning. If Section 2 somehow survives intact, the damage is limited. The courts will still be there to slow down the worst impulses, and the maps may shift a little more gradually. But if the Supreme Court rules that Section 2 doesn't apply to redistricting, we will cross a line that is hard to uncross. The 2026 midterms will take place on a field designed by the same people playing the game, and the results will reflect that design. And when that happens, the outcome next November won't feel like a choice made by the voters. It'll feel like something that was decided months earlier when the maps were drawn, the rules were rewritten, and the last real checks on power started to give way. And unfortunately, to me right now, it feels like we may be headed down that path. That's where I'm going to leave it for today. If you enjoyed or learned something new, please feel free to like and subscribe. More videos coming soon. If you're interested in learning more about about anything I talked about today, please feel free to check out my sources in the description down below. I'd highly recommend doing so, as they may shine some more light on some of the points I made throughout this video. Finally, if you're interested, remember to go check out my newsletter and my Substack if you want. I'm looking for any feedback there whatsoever. If you love it, let me know. If you hate it, let me know. Everything's appreciated. Thank you so much for all your continued support. I really appreciate it. Hope I see you next time. Take care.